Hi, my name is Matt Moore, and this is going to be a short talk on post-truth. And this talk is really a response to another talk given by Dave Clarke. He's given these talks on a number of occasions about post-truth. Dave is the CEO of Synaptica, and he's also somebody I've met a couple of times and someone that I like and respect. So what follows is not necessarily an attack or a critique on Dave. It's a genuine attempt to engage with his ideas and hopefully move the debate forward. Before we go on, I'd encourage you to pause this video and either have a look at one of Dave's talks or read one of the transcripts. There are links in the show notes below. I'll still be waiting here until you've done that, so I'll see when you get back from that. If you haven't done that, then some of the things I say here probably won't make a lot of sense. Welcome back. So I want to start by going through some of Dave's ideas, just making sure I'm positioning things properly. And I want to start with, well, what the hell is post-truth? So here we have two pictures from 2016. On the left-hand side, we have Donald Trump looking very happy, having won the US presidential election. On the right-hand side, we have David Cameron looking very sad, having lost the UK Brexit referendum. Now, both of these events were quite shocking, and they were especially shocking for people like myself and Dave, male, white, middle-aged, middle-class, university-educated technocrats, basically. We were shocked by these shouldn't have happened, and immediately we looked around to see why it happened and who we could blame. Now, one set of explanations you can broadly label post-truth. The position here is that politics used to be based on truth, evidence, rational discourse between engaged citizens, and all good stuff like that. Right? That's no longer the case. Now politicians have no regard for the truth, i.e. most of the things that come out of Donald Trump's mouth, the claims written on the side of buses as part of the Brexit campaign, and citizens no longer hold them accountable for this. And even more so, citizens do not listen to each other. Terms like polarization are thrown about quite a lot. Okay, so why is this? Well, one set of factors that have been blamed for this are new technologies, such as social networks, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and search. And they have created filter bubbles that lead to populaces that are less informed and more polarized. Other things that are brought into play are things like the micro-targeting of political ads, social bot attacks by hostile states like Russia, fake news factories, maybe not from hostile states, but certainly from financial opportunists, and also trolling. And all these things undermine our democracy. So I'd like to start by establishing what I agree on with Dave, because I think we agree on a lot. Now, here's a statement from one of Dave's talks. I would like to live in a society that is open-minded, fact-loving, search-savvy, and truth-seeking. I can get behind that. In fact, I think most people can get behind that, and it's in danger of being a motherhood statement. There are very few people who say they want to live in a closed-minded, fact-hating society. He goes on to say, to this end, we need to hold our political leaders, businesses and institutions accountable to adopt truthfulness as a core value. And yes, I agree with that. To respect data privacy, wholeheartedly agree with that. And in plain and simple terms, not to deal in lies. Again, I think all of us could get behind this statement. One thing I do say is that I want to put off data privacy to one side. I think it's an immensely important issue, but I also think it is linked but separate to what we're talking about here. So I'm not really going to discuss it further. Okay, so yeah, I can get behind this. Other things that we agree on. So the internet has democratized the world of information. It leveled the playing field between citizens and institutions, and it gave a voice to many previously marginalized individuals and communities. I agree with this. Neither Dave or myself are Luddites. We do not want to throw all technology in the bin. In fact, in both cases, our careers wouldn't exist without the technologies that we're talking about here. And in fact, very key parts of my personal life wouldn't exist without them either. Okay, a final slide about what we agree on. So I think we would both agree on the need for personal responsibility. There is no point in identifying problems if we ourselves as individuals are not willing to do something about them. Right? I think we also recognise that that's not enough. We need collective action. So we need to work together to solve the problems that we have. We both agree, I think, on the need for regulation of some of these entities that are involved. Also the need for competition in the marketplace of these technologies. And as key part of that would then be technological alternatives to the systems and companies that we have now. So I think we're broadly in agreement on all of that. Now I want to move into where I have perhaps different positions to Dave. And I want to start with this concept of post-truth. I think it is interesting that the constituency that has been most vocal in expressing concern around the concept of post-truth and also in raising it as a problem are, as I mentioned, mostly white, male, Anglophone, middle-class, middle-aged technocrats, right? Of which I am one, although not a very powerful one in the scheme of things. And I think part of the reason for that is we were one of the few groups who view the world as being fair and rational, and then when it isn't fair and rational, it shocks and appalls us. For other groups in society that maybe do not have the power that we have, it's no surprise at all. The shock factor is much less. And in fact, when you think about it, and I'm going to be massively unfair to Dave here, there is some similarity between the Make America Great Again, Take Back Control mob and then the post-truth movement. Although movement is probably giving it too much coherence, right? So I've got here Make America Great Again versus Make Truth True Again. I've got pictures of two people. In both the Make America Great Again and the Make Truth True Again, there is a view that the world was better in the past. When that exactly was is somewhat vague. Were we living in a truth society when we had the GFC collapse in 2008, based on the flagrant mis-selling of financial products? Were we in the truth era in 2003 when we invaded Iraq on the basis of non-existent weapons of mass destruction? I'm not going to hammer that point home. I'm just going to let it sit there, right? So the world was a better place in the past. The past is somewhat vague as to when that is. The world is bad now, right? And we need to do something about it, right? Now, they differ about when that golden age was. For the manga people, the past was the dominance of American industrial economic power, when we had steel and coal and all that kind of stuff. And for the post-truth brigade, the past was at its peak when we had the rule of truth, facts and evidence. So I will come back to that murky golden age and some of the issues with it very shortly. But first, I want to subject to a couple of Dave's claims to some empirical analysis. Now, the first question I'm going to ask is, are filter bubbles real? As they are something that Dave refers to fairly frequently. And the evidence on this is really mixed, right? First of all, there's a US study that does find that society is more polarised, and we'll come back to that in a little bit as to why that might be. But that polarisation is largest among the groups least likely to use the internet and social media. Another piece of research on the Australian Twitter sphere finds scant evidence for the existence of exclusive echo chambers or filter bubbles. Yet another piece of research, I think again back in the US, does find some evidence of echo chambers and filter bubbles, but somewhat intuitively, the channels that are associated with this are also associated with an increase in an individual's exposure to material to other sides of the political spectrum. So these platforms open people up to other points of view rather than just closing them down to a single point of view. And then finally, and this is a piece of research from the UK, it finds that people most likely to be in echo chambers are those who are not particularly interested, who do not use diverse media, and who make up a relatively small percentage of the population, about 8%. So it's not a given that we all live in filter bubbles. And I think I would note that a lot of the discussion around filter bubbles is generally about other people. It's other people who live in echo chambers. It's other people who are subjected to filter bubbles, not us. And I think we need to perhaps pay a little bit more attention to this concept and view it in perhaps a more critical manner. Now, another concept that Dave talks about is micro-targeting. That's where an advertiser uses a platform like Facebook to send a very specific message to a very small number of people, right? And that means that you can send different and potentially contradictory messages to different people, right? And also, you are not obliged to say that you are the provider of that message. So again, you can target the supporters of your opponents and also attempt to make them less likely to vote. Right? So, does micro-targeting work? Well, the issue we have here is that many of the parties involved in these activities are inherently untrustworthy. So the providers of these services like Facebook will say one thing to one group. So they will tell businesses that this is the most devastatingly effective form of advertising ever invented. And then in front of, say, government entities that might want to regulate them, they go, no, this is just another form of advertising. And then on the part of the political parties involved, you will have people like Donald Trump's digital campaign manager saying how awesome this is, but then of course he would say that. So it is actually quite hard to identify how effective these techniques are. Nevertheless, here are some indicative things. There was a study in Spain that looked at the US election and that found that micro-targeting was effective, especially on undecided low information voters, right? But at most it had the impact of 1 or 2 percentage points. Now in a very tight election, that was probably enough. But again, it seems to be effective at the margin, right? Another data point is that just before the 2017 UK election, marketing guru Mark Ritson said that he predicted the Conservatives would win a majority in that election because they were better at digital marketing. He was proved spectacularly wrong by that. Right? And then finally, people that do know and measure the effect of digital marketing techniques, consumer goods companies, have actually been more skeptical about the impact of them. So Procter & Gamble cut $200 million of digital ad spend and redistributed it to more traditional channels, and that actually had a positive effect for their business. So people that are able to measure or have a better chance of measuring the impact of micro-targeting are not necessarily finding it as effective as claimed. Now my position, and I should note that I currently work for a old media company, so make of that what you will, is that I don't think micro-targeting is ineffective. I think it can have some impact, but I suspect that that impact is relatively small in the scheme of things. It is not a thermonuclear weapon that will devastate every election that happens, or certainly not at this stage. There's a few other things that Dave talks about, like Russian bots, that, yeah, I completely agree with him on, so I'm not really going to talk more about here. Okay, now I want to focus on a statement that Dave makes that I think a lot of us would agree with on first look, but on closer inspection doesn't hold up. And this might be a bit controversial. So that statement is that democracy relies on a well-informed public. I just don't think that's true. I don't think it is true empirically, nor do I think it should be true normatively. And I think there's quite a lot of research that backs me up on this. Here is one example, a book called Democracy for Realists. The point of these authors is that basically voting publics are not well informed on issues. Their primary drivers are tribal loyalties and identity, or how the economy feels like it's doing at the time. They have not read the manifestos of the parties involved. They're voting on the basis of other things. And here Brian Kaplan makes a similar but related point. From his perspective, voters are fundamentally irrational, and they encounter politicians who are incentivized, therefore, to take advantage of that. Right. So, therefore, politicians are encouraged to lie inadvertently by their electorates. And I think this is largely true. So the next three slides that I've got draw very heavily on the work of Bobby Duffy, who was formerly at Ipsos Mori, and a book he published last year called The Perils of Perception, which is all about ignorance and misperception. It is a fascinating book, right? His point is that political ignorance is not a new thing. It has been going on for decades, and it remains largely unchanged. That golden age the post-truthers refer to was mostly an illusion, right? We have been mostly ignorant throughout the history of our democracy. But he also says that we overestimate how disengaged we are from the political process. Now, what this chart shows is the gap between the reality of voting behaviour versus what voters in different countries think it is. And it indicates that in, say, France, Italy, Great Britain, more people actually vote than the population on average thinks vote. Although, again, interestingly, at the bottom, perception and reality in the US are quite closely aligned. The next thing I want to talk about is polarization, which is a big topic. Now, again, Duffy here has the perspective that polarization is not as strong as we perceive it to be. This is a chart from the Netherlands, and it basically says that party identification drops by generation. Pre-war, the greatest generation, whatever you want to call them, are more associated and engaged with committed to particular political parties, and millennials are less committed, right? So commitment to party has actually dropped over time. Now, this actually contradicts some of the other evidence that's come out, that especially in the US, that talks about more polarized populations. And I think a useful insight into why this might be comes from a book called The Big Sort. Now, The Big Sort was published in 2008, and it basically says the US has changed, right? And its evidence here is in 1976. We have a map of election results which shows that many counties are competitive. And then we go to this other map in 2004, which shows that competitive counties are much smaller in number. And what's happened is people have sorted themselves. They've sorted themselves by their political beliefs, by their behaviours, their professions, all kinds of things. So in a sense, people have clustered together more. So it's not the case that filter bubbles and echo chambers originate on the internet. They actually happen in physical space. They have happened in physical space first. Now, Bishop's work on the Big Sort has come in for some criticism, but recent research has backed it up. that does appear to be what's happening. And that is in some senses a problem created by the success of American society in terms of its mobility. Interestingly, in societies that are less geographically mobile, you tend to see less polarisation. And I want to talk about the UK here and Brexit. This is a map of the Brexit vote by geographic region. The bluer it is, the bigger the leave vote. The yellower it is, the bigger the remain vote. And I think what's interesting here is how geographically split the UK is. And the remain vote is very strong in London. It's strong in large, culturally diverse cities. It's strong in university towns. It's strong in Scotland and parts of Wales. And it is weak everywhere else, right? So the attitude that you have towards staying in the EU or not is very linked to where you are geographically. Now, finally, I would like to make reference to my own personal experience. Now, this is a picture of the library in my hometown. And I sometimes think, listening to post-truthers, that we lived in a golden age where we'd all go down the library and deeply research things before forming opinions. And in my experience, we didn't do that. Now, I did go down the library a lot to read books and research things, which is obviously why I was so immensely popular at school. So in my experience growing up, we were ignorant. We were ignorant of lots of things. That didn't really matter, because we generally knew the things that we needed to live day to day. But I wouldn't say we were wonderfully politically informed, right? So again, I think the golden age argument does not really agree with my lived experience. And just as a side note, I live in Australia, but I was back in the UK last year for the first time in years, and I spoke to people about the Brexit vote. I spoke to my father about it, and I won't tell you how he voted. How he voted actually surprised me, but he said, I thought I needed to sit down and research what this was all about and find out about it and form a considered, informed opinion, right? However, he was pretty much the only person I spoke to who did that, right? That is unusual behaviour. Now, I haven't really been talking too much about the technology companies so far, the likes of Google and Facebook, and I haven't really been blaming them very much. Now, I do actually think that these companies are sometimes the whipping boys or scapegoats for societal problems that are not primarily their fault. But I certainly don't want to let them off the hook, right? In many areas, they have made things worse, especially in their lackadaisical approach to dangerous content and behaviours. I'm thinking here of far-right or terrorist or racist materials that they've been quite blasé in terms of letting spread across their platforms, including this one. I think of Facebook's behaviour in Burma, where its tools have actually been used to commit acts of genocide. So largely, these platforms and their owners they're concerned with making money. They're not really concerned with the betterment of society, no matter what they say. Or rather, they don't see any difference between their growth and the betterment of society. I think in many cases, they don't actually see how they can do anything wrong. So I would say, whilst they may not be the causes of some of the problems that we have, they are not making things better, and they are accelerants, right? That's why I've got a can of gasoline here. They are accelerating tendencies in our societies that are not good. So again, I'm kind of coming back and saying that I agree with Dave that I think things like regulation, right, are required here. And if these companies won't regulate themselves, then we need to. And if we can't regulate them, then perhaps we should break them up, or they should not exist in their current form. So, looping back to Dave's original statement about democracies and well-informed populaces. I would say that democracies must function even if their publics are busy, lazy, ill-informed and bigoted. If you create a bicycle for the mass market and only an Olympic-grade cyclist can ride it without injuring themselves, then you're going to get a lot of injuries. I think we need to design our democracies not for best-case scenarios. We need to make them robust enough to handle what is likely to be the worst or even just the real case. So to do that, I think the democracies need to have the broadest possible access to the democratic process, which is why stories of voter suppression that you hear from particular countries particularly horrify me. And I think you need to have representatives that actually represent their constituents, not the parties of whom they are a member, nor wealthy interests that fund them, right? And I think we can't get away from representative democracy. I think some of the claims that have been made about direct democracy, and yes, I am talking about my vote and the Flux Party here, are foolish at best, right? Moving on, I think information is required that is accessible, right? That means it's affordable, right? That means it's usable. And lots of information that is produced by government and other agencies, I would say, is not usable. And also it needs to be useful, right? People need to be able to do things with it. Going back to that information, I think it needs to be diverse in terms of the perspectives it comes from, right? Which means that if you only have one or two media companies in a society, that is probably a bad thing. Now, I think the internet is quite good for this, theoretically, but I think we'll have to see how it happens in practice, right? Again, information source diversity, formats, by that I mean it needs visual, audio, text, different styles and emotional registers. I think sometimes with the post-truth community we can focus a lot on just the facts, ma'am, right? And we need to recognise that human beings are primarily emotional creatures, right? The facts by themselves don't cut it. And we need to engage with people on multiple levels, both empirical and fact-based, and emotional and personal. Finally, decision-making processes and expertise, right? So those decision-making processes need to represent those diverse constituencies. They need to use evidence. They need to produce good decisions, and then they need to communicate those decisions reliably and effectively using diverse formats and emotional registers. And as part of that, we absolutely need experts who are respected and used appropriately, but are not necessarily running the system. And I suppose it's here that I disagree with Michael Gove. Now, again, I'm worried that what I've put up here is a bunch of motherhood statements, but I'm not really sure what to do about that. So another claim that Dave makes is we need an online information commons that is non-partisan, beyond the reach of individual commercial interests, a digital equivalent of the public library. Now, when I read this, I immediately thought, well, we've got that, right? It's called Wikipedia. It is a non-partisan information commons beyond the reach of individual commercial interests. So I'm kind of interested in terms of what Dave thinks is wrong with Wikipedia, and I will absolutely admit that I think there are serious flaws in its operation and serious risks to its future. But I would also say that rather than dreaming up new infrastructure, we probably need to start with what we've got already and work from there. So my question would be, how do we make something like Wikipedia work better? And what is it failing at now that it can't help us with in these efforts, rather than trying to create something? Now, Dave talks about creating the digital equivalent of a public library, and my other suggestion for that would be, well, how about a public library? We already have a public library infrastructure. As we've looked at already in this talk, the physical world that people live in matters, right? Their geographic location matters. And yet in the UK, what we have is the wanton wholesale destruction of the public library system, which just brings me to tears. So what I would like to see some of the post-truth people doing is being far more vocal about our existing library infrastructure and actually looking at ways of incorporating it into our decision-making and social processes, getting more people into the library, and then getting the information riches that are in libraries more embedded in their communities. I've mentioned already, I think representation is kind of key to democracy. And here I'm quite influenced by David Runciman. And I think we need to talk about conflict and representation and some of the fissures that are opening up in Western societies. And there are 4 areas that I want to talk about, 2 of which are getting a lot of attention and 2 of which not nearly enough. Now, the first one is economic inequality. I think some of the conflicts and political disagreements that are opening up are actually about real disagreements with people. And we do have increasing levels of economic inequality in Western societies, and that is a bad thing, right? And that's a material problem, right? And that will drive a lot of conflictual behaviours, right? I think the other thing we need to look at is ethnicity and nationalism, as we've recently seen so horrifically in Christchurch, right? But also, again, all over the world, this resurgence in terms of ethnic identity, right? And how do we handle that? And again, how do we handle anxieties around that? What does that mean for the information that people are getting and the kind of conversations that are happening? So those I think are quite widely debated, if not necessarily well understood. And then the other 2 are age. We have aging societies, right? We also have societies where traditionally the old have not necessarily wielded a lot of power, and that is changing. And the balance of power between different age groups certainly was expressed in something like Brexit, right? And then the thing that's linked to that is around education. And here I mean higher education, right? So historically, a vanishingly small percentage of populations went to university. That's not the case anymore. There's still a minority, but there are a large minority who happen to run everything, right? And again, one of the biggest predictors of voting for Brexit was not having gone to university, right? So these fissures in our society are causing real material problems, not just informational ones, but I think we need to consider what we do about them in terms of the information systems we design. And I particularly think we need to think about representation in terms of how we build these systems and who we involve in that process. I think we are getting better, for example, at recognizing that we need to involve women and people of different ethnic experiences and people of different sexualities and people especially with disabilities in terms of how we design our information products. What we don't necessarily think about too much is age. We need to think more about that. And then education. And I think it's fair to say that the people that design information systems almost all come from the university educated class. And I think we have not considered the impact of that on the tools that we design. Now, the next thing I want to consider is education. Now, education has to bear a lot of weight in these debates because it is almost the go-to solution for everything. For any social problem we have, we think we can fix it with education, either by telling people what they should do or giving them more skills, right, so they can perform better in the job marketplace. Now, I am also committed to education. I have 2 degrees, I teach at a university, but I have some concerns about whether it can actually bear the load that has been put on it. And there's a fascinating article written last year by Dana Boyd about media literacy, which I would encourage you to read. I've got a few quotes from it here, but basically her concern is that media literacy basically boils down to left-wing people asking their students to critique right-wing content, which while might have some validity, ends up putting people off, alienating people, and not necessarily doing what it needs to do. Her proposal, I think, is an interesting twist on that, which is rather than encouraging people to recognise fault lines in the media landscape, who are the bad guys and who are the good guys, but rather to explore difference and to explore themselves and to engage in much more subtle acts of interpretation. Now, I don't know if that is the right answer, but I do suspect that whilst education is necessary, we have to be careful how we do it, and we have to recognise its limits and what it can and can't do. Almost done. One thing I do want to refer to is the deliberative democracy movement, which I think is I'm not wholly bought into, but I think is a really interesting initiative. That's things like people's parliaments, people's juries, that kind of thing, where you get members of the public to sit down with experts and to work through issues in a considered manner over a period of time. Right? I do have some concerns that I think it attempts to take the dirt and the conflict out of politics, right? Which I think is always going to be there. So I think that I'm concerned perhaps about its disavowal of human nature sometimes. But I certainly think it is an area worth exploring beyond media literacy, beyond attempting to control the information that people see, but to actually perhaps build a considerative, a deliberative capacity in our societies, which we largely haven't done. So it is something I would like to see explored more. Finally, I want to talk about anxiety and fear. And I want to talk about 5 fears that I sense in the post-truth movement, not a movement, domain. And I want to say I don't necessarily ascribe all of these to Dave, especially the last one, but I do want to go through them one by one. Now, the first one is animotophobia, which is fear of emotion. And I think I've alluded to this earlier. I think some of our discussions around post-truth and truth focus on facts and evidence and their importance, and they are important, but we cannot neglect the matter that human beings are fundamentally emotional creatures, right? So hence we can't be afraid of emotion. We have to find ways of incorporating it in our solutions to things. The next one I want to talk about is haphiphobia. I'm not sure I've pronounced that right. That is fear of touching or being touched. And I think what I'm trying to touch on here is a lack of concern with the material world that I sort of vaguely sensed in some of Dave's suggestions, right? When you look at the things that are driving us apart, they are not primarily informational, right? They are geographic, they are material, they are things like wealth and age and education and ethnicity, right? Which, whilst our ideas, are also real things. So I would therefore encourage us to look at not just informational issues, but material aspects of our personal and collective experience. Right, the next one is rupophobia, and that is fear of filth. Right, again, I've alluded to this a little bit earlier. I sometimes think that the post-truth discourse, this ideal of politics, it's somewhat antiseptic. It doesn't have spaces for conflict. It doesn't really have spaces for the muck, the dirt, the reality of politics, the reality of human existence. Right. So therefore, I would encourage the post-truthers to think about dirt, filth, whatever, and to incorporate the dirty reality of our lives into their solutions and not aim for an overly sanitized and frankly unreachable ideal in politics. And that really feeds directly into the fourth one, which is politicophobia, which is fear of politics, the political process, politicians, that kind of thing. I don't think we should be afraid of politics. I think we should embrace it in all its filthy, disgusting glory. I think we should not be, as I've said before, antiseptic about it. And again, in some of the post-truth areas, some of the discussions, I feel a reluctance to fully grasp the political implications of what they're suggesting. If we are going to regulate technology companies, that will be a political battle, and it will be a dirty political battle. I can guarantee you that, right? So if you are going to effect change, the one thing you cannot be afraid of is politics. And then finally, now chronophobia. Now that's fear of the passage of time or the future. And to be absolutely fair to Dave, I think he does not have that. I think he is not afraid of the future. With some of the post-truth narrative, I get the sense there is this like harking back to a lost golden age, a desire to return to the past, right? I don't think we can go back to the past. All we can do is build a new and better future. And I genuinely think that's what Dave Clarke wants to do. That's what I want to do. And I really hope we can do it together. So, as you can probably tell, this video has been put together at quite high speed and the production qualities are quite low. Some of the things in it, though, I've been thinking about for quite a period of time. I just wanted to end with some of the books that have kind of inspired some of the things that I've been saying over the last few minutes. I'd encourage you to read them. I'd also really value your opinions, comments, abuse, whatever. The comments field is open below. Go wild. Thank you very much for your time.